Hi. So I work for the UK government, and until 2012, this was the UK government's website. This was where, as a UK citizen, you would find information out. And this is a tax credit calculator. I think I'm going to use the hand mic. Okay. So this is a tax credit calculator. So a tax credit is an incentive from the UK government to encourage certain behaviours like investing, parenting, and it gives you money off your tax bill. So this calculator allowed you to put in information about your income and your behaviours and work out how much of a tax credit you could get. So as a UK citizen, if you saw a mistake in this calculator, and you wanted to, let them know to correct it. Firstly, you'd have to get in touch with DirectGov. So somewhere on this page would be a contact DirectGov. You'd get in touch with them and tell them about the mistake. And that might be difficult, but let's say that was all fine and you found the right person to talk to. Then they would then have to contact the supplier of this website. Because the website was outsourced. What happened there? Okay, to an external supplier. And to get that external supplier to investigate as to whether the mistake you'd found was actually required a code change, to get them to investigate that would cost tens of thousands of euros. And then if they did determine that a code change was required, it would then cost hundreds of thousands of euros. No matter how small the code change was, it would cost hundreds of thousands of euros, and the estimate would be maybe 6 to 12 months. And the releases were big bang releases once a year, so if you timed it badly, it would probably take about 18 months for your code fix to go in. But honestly, if it was a small change, it probably wouldn't get done anyway, because that's a lot of money. Okay, in 2012, we launched the gov.uk website. And this is another tax calculator. This is a child benefit tax calculator. Child benefit is money you get from the government for each child you have. But if you earn over a certain amount, you have to pay tax on that benefit. And this calculator allows you to put in your income and the number of children and other facts and to find out how much tax you'd have to pay. And earlier this year, in January, a member of the public found an error in this tax calculator. So I just want to point out that it's quite an edge case. It's in the scenario where you are claiming child benefits, so you have children under 18. You're also claiming a pension, and you also earn over 55,000 euros a year. So it's quite an edge case. It probably didn't affect anyone, or very few people if so. But there was an error, and somebody spotted it. So on the 24th of January this year, so he found the code on GitHub for this calculator. On the 24th of January, he made a code fix and raised a pull request against that code. That was a Sunday. On the Monday, the 25th of January, the team looked into that code fix, talked to the tax team, and worked out that was, in fact, an error. It was merged on the 27th of January and deployed on the 29th of January. So that's quite a big change from the way that the previous site used to work and how the UK government handled its code. So I'm going to talk to you now about how we got to that situation, how we are coding in the open now, what that looks like for us, and where we're going next with it. My name's Anna Shipman. I am a technical architect, and I am also the open source lead. So how did we get here? So this goes back to 2010, when Martha Lane Fox, who was then the UK government's digital champion, was asked to do a report on DirectGov, which was the first website that I showed you. But her report actually went further, and she looked at the whole way that the UK government interacted with UK citizens digitally, and she made several recommendations. And one of them was the formation of a unit in government to work on this kind of thing specifically, and that was the Government Digital Service. That's who I work for. The Government Digital Service is a unit of government within the Cabinet Office, which is in the centre of the UK government. And our job is to change the way that government works, to transform the interaction between the citizen and the state. The first thing we did was launch the gov.uk website, which I've shown you. And the next thing we did was we worked with 8 departments, 8 different parts of government to transform various services to make them better for for users, for citizens. The aim being to make digital services so good that people prefer to use the online route rather than the phone or face-to-face or by letter. So by services, so the gov.uk website is how you get information. A service is like an interaction with government, maybe how you give government information or pay money or something like that. So I'll give you a couple of examples of services that we transformed. So the first one I want to talk about is personalized license plates. You can't do this in the same way in Germany. In Germany, you can pay some money and you can change some of the numbers and letters on the license plate. In the UK, you can change the entire license plate using numbers and letters to spell out words or names or something like that. So this is one where she's used letters and numbers to spell out her name, Jenny. And if you sell your car, presumably you want to keep the license plate that you've personalized. You don't want that to go with your car. So you have to apply to DVLA, the Driver and Vehicle Licensing Authority, to get authorization to keep that license plate. And that service is called retain a license plate. Before we worked on this, you had to fill in this form. It goes on for much longer than I've shown you here, and send it to DVLA, and they would send back a confirmation in the post. So it could take some weeks. And you also had to pay £105, which is about 120 euros. And after we transformed this, you can now do this online. It updates DVLA's records in real time, so you get instant authorization of whether you can keep that license plate, so you can sell your car quickly. And also, because of this work, the cost of the transaction went down, so it now costs £80, which is about 90 euros, and that was passed on to the people paying for the service. And this service receives 91% user satisfaction, which is pretty good for a government service. And the code for this is on GitHub, on DVLA's organization. They coded in the open from the beginning, so you can see the way that that whole project developed. So personalized license plates is nice, it's kind of fun, but it's kind of trivial. So the next service I want to talk about is something that's more serious, which is booking a visit to see somebody in prison. So studies have shown that 45% of prisoners lose contact with their friends and their families while they're in prison, which is sad for them, but it's also bad for society, because studies have shown that people who are not visited when they're in prison are 39% more likely to commit another crime when they're released. So one of the main points of prison is rehabilitation. So we don't want people to come out of prison and commit more crimes, carry on. We want people to be rehabilitated. So it's in the interest of society that we help make it easy for people to receive visits from their friends and family. So the service that we worked on here, this is how it used to work. The prisoner would initiate this process by filling in this form. So they'd have to give the address and date of birth. They'd have to remember the address and date of birth of everyone they'd like to receive a visit from. They would give this form to a prison guard who would then send it to that person. The visitor would then send a letter back requesting a date. The prison would then send a letter back confirming the date or saying, no, you have to pick another date. And again, this could go backwards and forwards. This could take weeks. This is just to arrange like a 1-hour visit to visit, a close relative. And you'd have to do this regularly, every time you wanted to visit them. The new service allows you, you could also do it on the phone, but the call centers were understaffed, so quite often you'd hear of people being on hold for 2 hours or ringing several times before and not being able to get through. So it was very difficult to get a visit booked. So the new service allows you to request up to 3 dates online, and then it takes a few minutes to fill in online, and then you get a confirmation by email within 3 days. Usually much quicker, but within 3 days. So it takes much less time out of your day to book the visit, and the whole process takes much less time. So it's much easier. And again, this service gets 85% user satisfaction, which is pretty good. And it also, that 85% includes the people who weren't able to get the times that they'd asked for. So that's quite a high rate of satisfaction. And again, the code for this service is online. Ministry of Justice's GitHub organization, and they coded in the open from the beginning, so you can see exactly how the service works and how it developed. So we worked with departments on those 25 services. We call them exemplar services. And our role now is to support and enable departments to do these transformations on their own. The way that services are built in the UK government, digital services, is by following this process. So you start with a discovery, and that's where you try and find out what the user needs are for the service. You then have an alpha, and that's where you build a couple of prototypes, or just a prototype, and get it in front of users to see whether you've got the right idea about how to meet their needs. You then, if you've got the right idea, you take one of those ideas forward into beta, and that could be operational and people using it. And then, if that's all well, the service goes live. So it's worth mentioning that you don't necessarily go like that. You might do a discovery and find out that you've got the user needs completely wrong, and you haven't understood your users. Or you might have to do a couple of alphas because you need to work out the right way to address those needs. But any service that gets to live will go through all these stages. And in order to pass from one stage to the next, you have to pass a service assessment, which is, it needs to pass the digital service standard, which is it's 18 criteria for what makes a good government digital service. And there's links at the end of this talk, so you can look that up if you want to look at it. But the one that's relevant to this talk is point 8, make all new source code open. So that means that any digital service that's delivered by the UK government has to, in order to progress and go live, make all of their new source code open. So essentially, this is a commitment that we've made. So why have we made this commitment? So there are a few reasons why coding in the open is a good and important thing to do. The first is the potential for reuse. So a lot of people, a lot of departments, a lot of parts of government are addressing the same problems. If you code in the open, then there's a possibility that another department or another team can see the code you've used, and that solves a problem for them, and they can just reuse it rather than wasting time and money by rewriting it themselves. So it's not necessarily the case that all the code will get reused, but if you make it open, you allow that possibility. If it's closed, you cut that possibility off. And you might think that, you might begin thinking this problem is completely unique. There's no way that anyone else will need to use it. But you don't know that, so you don't necessarily know what's going to be useful to others. If by coding in the open, you allow that possibility to, you allow that to happen. You allow people to see that your code addresses their problem. And it also increases transparency. Ultimately, we are spending public money, and this coding in the open allows the public to see how that money is being spent. So another nice thing about coding in the open is it's really nice to show what you're working on. So the gov.uk website went through the stages I was talking about, alpha, beta, live, and by the time we got to live, the service was fully operational, and all that remained to do was remove the banner that said this service is in beta. So this pull request is just removing that banner. It's essentially launching the gov.uk site by removing the beta banner. So this was in public, so my colleague Divon raised this pull request, and people started commenting about how happy they were that this was finally happening. So a lot of these people work for GDS, but many of them don't. Many of them are people, in the public commenting. So it's really nice to be able to share what you're doing publicly. So coding in the open is the default position. But there can be some potential downsides. So I'll talk about what some of those are. It can be difficult to get started. So as a team, it can be difficult to get started as a new team that's used to coding in a closed source way. I'll talk about that a bit later. But also, as a new member of the team who code in the open, it can be pretty intimidating. If you've come from a background where, when you have your code reviewed, the only people who see it are you and the person reviewing the code, to suddenly be in a position where literally anyone in the world could see what comments have been made on your pull request before it's merged. That can be quite stressful. So the way we deal with that is, I mean, firstly, we're aware of that. So nobody has to commit code on their first day if they're not comfortable doing it. We do a lot of pairing. And we have some very clear guidelines about how to do pull request code reviews and pull request reviewing in a constructive way. So this is our pull request guidance. Again, that's on GitHub, so you can go and have a look at that. And we've also built some kind of automated tool. We've built in automated tooling and various other ways to make the process easier and more constructive for everyone. And this is a good blog post that's worth reading about that. So the other potential downside to coding in the open is the possibility of committing something that you shouldn't. For example, passwords or credentials. So it's worth mentioning that this could happen anyway. Even if your code is completely closed source, so there's always an opportunity for you to leak things, for security to fail and for you to leak secrets. But with coding in the open, particularly, well, in fact, with any kind of security, the important thing is to be able to recover quickly. So this is in an environment of continuous deployment. As soon as a mistake is observed, we can immediately fix it and correct it and deploy the code immediately, definitely within minutes. So that's I'm going to talk a bit more about security later. But as well as being able to recover quickly, you should also build in processes that make it harder to make mistakes. So in this case, talking about committing passwords, you want to separate your code from your configuration. You shouldn't really be having passwords or credentials in your code base. And if you separate the code and configuration, then the passwords are not going into the code and they're not being made public. And so this is a reason why coding in the open from the beginning is a good idea, because it forces you to do things properly. It forces you to do things like separate your code and configuration. If your first commit your first commit in the open doesn't contain passwords, and then you're in the habit of coding in the open. There are some cases, though, where the code should not be committed, where we should keep the code closed-sourced. And I'll talk about a few of those. This is a blog post where we talk about that in more detail. So one type of code that you might want to keep closed-sourced is configuration. Maybe. So this is the gov.uk Puppet repository. This is also open on GitHub. Puppet is how we provision our servers in production. So this is the configuration for gov.uk. And that is coded in the open. It wasn't coded in the open from the beginning, so we had to go through a process of cleansing it and making sure that there weren't credentials and that kind of thing, and making sure that we've cycled all passwords that might have come out in that. And this is a really good blog post that details how we did that. But essentially, the configuration now, apart from a few things, private keys, secrets, is all out there, and you can go and have a look at it. So don't assume that configuration also has to be kept closed source. Another thing that you might want to keep closed source is anything to do with security. Maybe. So this is a blog post. So this is a blog post by the gov.uk Verify team. Gov.uk Verify is a service for confirming citizens' identity to government. So that's something where security is very important because it's people's personal data. And this project uses SAML, which is Security Assertion Markup Language. And they write a lot about how they use SAML, and some of their code is also open. So hang on, let me give you another example. This is GCHQ's GitHub organization. GCHQ is Government Communications Headquarters. So that's the UK's intelligence agency. And they have some open source. They're not coding in the open, but they are opening some of their code. So the way we think about security the context has changed. It's no longer the case that you can just say, this needs to be closed, security says no. And again, this is a blog post that's worth reading. But the main point is that security is now, it's not just about the technology, it's holistic. It's about the users, it's about the culture, it's about the behavior, things like separating code from configuration. The focus needs to be on how quickly you can recover from mistakes. It used to be about how you can make it harder to make mistakes, but mistakes will happen. And now the focus is about how can you reduce the mean time to recovery. And it's worth talking a little bit about how security, if your security depends on nobody knowing how it works, then it's probably not very good security. So a good example is with, say, a padlock. Everybody knows how a padlock works. It's still secure. What you need to keep secret is the key. So again, you might think that you can't code in the open with things to do with security, but actually a lot of that can also be done in the open. And the third case where we say that you might want to keep the code closed-sourced is with policy that's not yet been announced. So if you work in commercial organizations, an analogy would be if a feature that's the marketing has not yet been done, you don't want information about that to leak before you're ready. But in that case, you code as if you're going to release it later. Once the policy is announced, make it public. So that means no credentials or secrets, good commit messages, good documentation. But you do that anyway, right? So I just want to take a moment to say we're not perfect. So I've given you some examples of some great stuff that we've done. The two services that I chose to tell you about as examples of coding in the open, part of the reason I chose those services is because they did it right. They coded in the open from the beginning. I can point you at their code on GitHub, and you can go and see all that. But there are some other services that are also really good that struggled with coding in the open because change can be very difficult. Coming from a background where everything has to be closed source, it can be very difficult to have that conversation. And many of these services started before we'd had those high-level conversations. So, for example, Register to Vote is a service which I love talking about because as part of transforming the service to make it digital, we had legislation changed to allow people to register individually rather than as a household. But they didn't code in the open, and they've started open sourcing their code. But this is some of it, but if you go and you look at it on GitHub, it's one commit, and the commit is open sourcing content. So that's because they didn't build it, they didn't code in the open, and they didn't build it on GitHub. And again, it's not like they didn't do anything wrong. The climate for them was difficult at that time, and change is very difficult. That team is working on how to open source the rest of it. So I'm telling you that because I don't want to stand here and say we're amazing and we've done everything right. It's not all perfect. And also because, to give you courage, if you want to do this in your organization, you can too. It doesn't have to be perfect from the beginning. If we can make changes like this in an organization as old as the UK Civil Service, then you can probably do that in some of your organizations if you want to. So I talked about the advantage of coding in the open being reuse. There's quite a lot of people who've used our code, but I'm just going to give you a visual example of some people who've used our code. So this is gov.uk again. This is gov.nz, New Zealand's government website. This is gov.il, Israel's government website. And this is lexingtonkentucky.gov, the website for Lexington's local government. And they've all used our GovUK front-end code. So it's really nice to see that. It saved them time and money. OK, so what I've talked about up until now is coding in the open. But we make a distinction between coding in the open and what I would call true open source. Because there are various things about our code, while open, that means that it's not open source. So firstly, we don't promise that we're going to support it. We don't promise it will work for you in your environment, that it will work for you without all the rest of our applications. It's just open. And we've not committed to maintain it. So if, for example, we find that there's a better way to do calculators or whatever, we'll just retire our calculator code and start working on the new code, which is not very good open source behavior. So we do have some open source projects at GDS. Most of those are in the infrastructure space, and this is there are links at the end of the talk. You can see the infrastructure open source we have. I'm just going to briefly talk about one project, which is vCloud Tools. This is a suite of Ruby gems for provisioning virtual machines in a VMware vCloud Director environment. At that time, our GovUK was hosted in a VMware vCloud Director environment. And these tools were originally coded in the open, but I led a team to make them truly open source. So I've written that up in a series of blog posts. Here's one of them. And basically to make them such that they were maintained and supported and other people could use them easily. And there were other parts of government who were also using the same kind of hosting environment, and so they started using the tools. So it was great that we were saving money across government. And we also found that there were some people in industry using the tools. So this was really exciting. We saw this tweet, somebody from a publishing company who was using vCloud Tools, and these likes are basically all my colleagues because we were really happy to see that somebody was using it. So we have done some open source, not just coded in the open, but there are challenges to maintaining open source in a work environment. Additional challenges to the ones I mentioned about coding in the open. I'm just going to talk about two of them and how we address them. The first is getting time to work on it. So people, once it's open source, people will raise issues, people will raise pull requests, and that doesn't always necessarily fit into the schedule of work that you have for your team. The way we dealt with that on the infrastructure team was we had open source Thursdays. So on Thursday, you could work on if there were outstanding issues or pull requests on vCloud Tools or of other of our open source, which is mostly Puppet modules. You could work on those, or you could work on maybe patches for other open source software that we used. And this worked for our team because a lot of our work was around those open source tools. It wouldn't necessarily work for a different team. That's just how we addressed it. And then the second problem is contributors wanting to take your project in a new direction, either one that you hadn't anticipated or maybe one that you don't want. And this is a perennial problem in open source. So, I mean, every open source project that's successful has this problem. Like a good example is GCC, the C compiler, which there was a fork running alongside for 5 years. So this is a problem. And the way we addressed it was basically, because we knew pretty much everyone who was using it, we just talked to people. Again, that wouldn't necessarily work if you don't know who's using your open source project, but that's what we did. Okay, so that's where we are at the moment. We have almost everything coded in the open, and we have some open source. So what's next for GDS open code? So I mentioned I'm the open source lead. I've got 3 priorities. They are, first of all, I'm going to try and work out what of our projects that are coded in the open would be most useful for other people, most useful to put the work in to make them actually open source or reusable. And not just GDS, like work in other departments as well. What of their code would be useful to share. I'm also going to be working on helping teams code in the open. So I mentioned, the register to vote team are having difficulties. I'll be working with teams to work out like how we can break down those barriers that make it hard to code in the open. And the third thing that I'm going to be focusing on that I haven't really talked about much, but it's very important, is I'm going to look at ways that we can increase our contributions to open source software. Because probably like a lot of you, we depend very heavily on open source projects that maybe don't have enough support. We do contribute patches back, but I'm going to be looking at how we can do that in a more concerted, useful way. So how can you get involved if you want to? A few suggestions. You could try and if you're not already, get your organizations coding in the open. I think even commercial organizations will have code that's not central to the mission that can be open, can be useful. And I hope that I've given you some suggestions of how to address some of the problems that will come up. There's also some resources at the end that might be helpful as well. you can let me know if there's any of our code, GDS's code, or other government's departments that you would like to use or have tried to use. That would be great. Because if there's something you'd like to use, then I'd be really interested in working out how we can make that easier. Or you can come and work for GDS. Thanks. Okay, so we do have time for questions. Okay.
Shall I do the mic, or you guys can read them as well? So the first question that we got is the civil service shrinking? Does UK Gov do more with less?
Is it? I don't actually know the answer if it is. But yeah, we're always trying to do more with less. I don't know. I don't know if it is actually shrinking. Sorry.
And are you using extreme programming practices?
Are we using extreme programming practices? And do we teach them? You don't know. Okay, so we're not using extreme programming. We do use agile methodology, which I know is something completely different, but it's in the same area. So we do, in terms of extreme programming, we do things like we do pair programming a lot. I'm not sure what the other ones we use. So we definitely don't follow strict XP. But we do work in an agile, multidisciplinary way. So teams are made up of mixed disciplines. So developers, user researchers, designers, technical writers, project managers, delivery managers. We have multidisciplinary teams, and we do follow agile. Mostly roughly Scrum. Again, not strictly Scrum, but it's pretty much roughly. And do we teach it? So I think we do go and work with departments to help with their agile working, which is not quite the same. So sort of. So the question was that there are forces against GDS. Are we going back to the old model? No, I don't think so. We still have the same mission to transform the relationship between citizen and state. We're still trying to improve things for our users. I don't think we're going back to how it was. Are they civil servants or contractors? How do we do support? Okay, so we're a mixture of civil servants and contractors. I don't know what statistics are, and it varies between projects, but we do have a lot of both. And then support. How do we do support?
Yeah, so I was just wondering, in terms of being able to support a project over a long time, you don't want to maintain a team of 10 people, but you might suddenly want to have a fix that requires 10 people to do because it's a security flaw or something. So yeah. How do you support that throughout everything?
So that really varies between teams. What we do on the gov.uk team is we have teams build projects, teams build applications, and a team will own several applications, so the team will be ongoing. And then we have a support rota where, let me think if this actually answers your question. Yeah, so I sort of segued into talking about out-of-hours support there, so that's not actually your question. Basically, we do have ongoing, like the idea of a project being finished and the team leaving is not quite the same. It's ongoing. It might be not the team's main focus, but the team will still own that project, basically. So if, maybe nobody's working on it and then it suddenly requires a fix, the whole team will stop the other things they're working on and work on it. Sorry, I'm very interested in our second line support model, so I nearly bored you all with that. Inner source. Have we thought about a middle way, open sourcing within the organization? So there is this idea of inner sourcing where you don't necessarily share it publicly, but you share it within the organization. My view is that it's not worth the effort because it's the way it's often easier to find out from the internet something about some open source than to find out what the team down the hall is working on, whatever your organization is. And I think if you have the backing, which we do, to push for things being properly open source, then I think it's worth doing that. I don't think it's worth putting the effort into the halfway house. The advantage of the halfway house is that you can share things that you maybe are not appropriate to make public, but the cost is the difficulty of communicating what people are working on, finding out what people are working on, sharing that information, and I just don't think that the benefit, I think the cost is too great. That's my view.
So how do you determine what services need to be open sourced, or how do you determine what service needs to be rewritten in a new approach?
Right.
Might be a bit open-ended question.
Okay, so the aim, I'll take the second part first. How do we determine which need to be rewritten? The aim is to make services digital by default, and the aim is to make services that are, the digital route is so good that people prefer it. So any service where that's not the case is a service that we would look at helping make that the case. So that's quite a lot. I mean, it's, at the moment it's a majority of what we've got. And then how do we determine whether it needs to be open source? Everything does. According to the service standard, coding in the open by default. I mean, there are some things where, maybe it's not, maybe they can present a good reason for why it can't be, but it's definitely the onus is on, it needs to be open unless you can really convince why it shouldn't be. Okay. Oh, another question?
Yeah, thank you, first of all. Living in Germany, I'm a bit jealous because we're not that far actually here. And I think in part that's due to the federal nature of the country. And have you had, so you're working for the central government, have you had areas where you wanted to provide services that are actually within the authority of a region or of, I don't know, Wales or Scotland, where you had to cooperate with these, or do you just leave those kind of topics out?
So GDS, we look at central government because we also have local governments, and so local government is currently outside GDS's remit. So occasionally there's, we work with them, but it's not in our.
Okay, so basically the central government is taking the first step, and then maybe.
Yeah, although a lot of the local governments are independent, but a lot of them are also doing really great work in this area. But it's dependent on each one.
Any more questions?
Okay, thank you very much.